As humans, we are hardwired to seek out safety through certainty. But when you set out to write your first memoir, there is precious little certainty to be found. And that's why today, based on years of working with clients on their first memoirs, I want to lay out what you can expect as you move through the process of your first memoir. Stay tuned. If you've been working on your memoir for a while, but you're not making the progress you want to make, I want to offer you something really practical. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to lay out every single step in the process from idea to finished book. And I know what you're thinking, a checklist? But truly, if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing next, there is very little chance you're going to actually do it. So this checklist will guide your way through not only making a plan, but then executing the plan all the way through holding that book in your hands. You can download it for free at pageandpodium.com/checklist. We are talking today about what you can expect when you set out in this process of writing your first book. And wherever you happen to be in this process, I suspect that you will identify some things that feel familiar, as well as some things that may be coming down the pike. And I hope that that's going to be really helpful for you as you're moving forward. I know, especially if you are someone like me who sets very, very high standards for everything you do, I know that it can feel really scary to set into a process that you really haven't experienced before. You really do not know what to expect. And so you don't really know how to optimize for the outcome that you want. If that lands, you are in the right place. But before we dive into all of that, I do want to just give a little note about certainty. I teased this video by noting that we, as humans, are hardwired to seek out safety by trying to find certainty. And I find that very often this kind of need for certainty that is, again, totally understandable, part of being human, can really delay projects because we will spend so much time trying to find clarity when often we actually just need to move forward to be able to find that clarity. So, suffice it to say, you may be looking for a type of certainty that you're not likely to find actually at any point in the process. And that's okay. Part of what we are doing when we write our first memoirs, any books, is building our capacity for discomfort. And the great news is that the very best books come out of your ability to expand that capacity for discomfort, your ability to sit in the gray area and feel around without needing to make everything clear, concise, concrete, and predictable from the very beginning. Now, if that feels like a bridge too far, let me say that this is one of the strongest arguments, in my opinion, for getting real support on your memoir. It is really difficult to hold the uncertainty of the emotional discomfort along with the uncertainty of really not knowing how the process works. So let me make a really quick pitch. If you would like a professional to work alongside you to make sure that this book is not only excellent quality, but that you also have an enjoyable healing experience throughout the process, we would love to work with you at Page and Podium Press. We work with people everywhere from the idea all the way to having a finished manuscript that you are ready to publish. And it just depends on where you want to jump in the process, but we would love to welcome you to work with us in the future. Okay, with that said, I want to move through what I've loosely identified as about 8 stages or about 8 things that you can expect to experience. Now, I'm moving through these in chronological order from the beginning of your memoir, actually before it, all the way through to the end of it. And what I'm basing this on is the dozens of women and men that I have worked with over the years to put their books together. Not everyone reacts in exactly the same way, but when you have been doing this as long as I have, with as many people as I have, you do start to see pretty clear patterns. So I wanted to share those with you today so that you can benefit from that struggle for discomfort that I've worked alongside so many authors to develop. All right, the first point that I want to highlight here is that actually you have been preparing to write this memoir for probably your entire life, simply by defining your voice. Now, I wanted to start with this one, not only because I do believe that this is something, it is a lifelong journey. This is something that we are always working on, always refining, shifting and changing even throughout our lives. But it's also the thing that tends to go totally underappreciated, if not completely unappreciated to begin with. When I talk about your voice, I find that very many people will hear me say that you need some kind of literary string of sentences, million-dollar words, beautiful vocabulary, poetic, symbolic sentence construction, and on and on. All of these beautiful things that we associate often with the literary world. Now, the problem here is when we think about what voice actually means, voice is not something that is limited to a particular way of writing. Voice is simply a reflection of how you communicate to your reader. And the reason that I want to point this out is that even if you have no formal writing training, if you have been writing regularly, and I think in this digital era we all pretty much do, you have already been refining your voice. Now, let me give you a couple of examples that I think might be surprising so that you can really think about where is your voice developing? Where have you been developing it just by nature of being alive in this world? Well, I want to give the first example of simply sending a text message. Now, when you think about sending a text message to your friends, your family, people who are close to you, you probably use a little bit different word choice, a little bit different construction, a little bit different sort of assembly of the things you want to say than if you were, say, writing a formal email or a formal letter to someone that you didn't know well. Well, those are two examples of voice, and what I want to say to you is that those are both perfectly acceptable, but for most modern readers, the way that you would think about that text message, the more personal, familiar way that you're going to speak to that person at the other end of the line, is going to actually be just as attractive, if not more so, than a very formal, very professional style that you might use for some kind of a letter. The second example that I want to give you is what it's like when you simply tell a friend a story. Now, there's lots of options here to think about this, but one thing I do want to note, and I have seen this especially, by the way, in folks I coach, both in our group coaching program and in one-on-one. When you think about telling some of these stories, there are probably stories that you have told very few times, maybe never, but I bet you've got stories that you have told over and over. So oftentimes I think of these as the stories that kind of get a laugh, right? Usually they're the kinds of things that are either kind of way out there, kind of even hard to believe, or they're just funny things, right? Funny little coincidences or whatnot. When you think about how you tell some of those stories that you've told over and over and over, I bet you've got particular patterns, particular kind of word repetition, particular structural repetition, particular outside references, particular context that you're using again and again. And the reason I feel so strongly that that's probably the case is one thing I see in coaching clients is those stories are so much easier to write. And the reason is you have been developing the voice that you're using to tell that story for years. In fact, it's not only those common stories. Every single thing we write is an expression of how we want to express ourselves. I will say, as a side note, this is one of my biggest concerns about this sort of AI revolution that we're in right now. I think there are a lot of reasons to worry about AI, but the one I worry about most is flattening out the human voice because we think it needs to sound some particular way for people to listen to us. In fact, you are much, much more likely to get the attention of the people that you want to speak to if you speak as yourself, if you can let go of needing it to be perfect so that it can be authentic. So, the first stage in any book project is developing your voice, but I want to tell you, you have already been doing that. One thing that I do find is as you start to intentionally apply that voice to your writing, it will start to feel better. It will start to feel more intentional, more purposeful, because there is something about the fact that just as humans, in talking, writing, all forms of communication, we are always developing our voice. That makes it easy to ignore that, but don't embrace it. Lean into your authentic, genuine, true self. That is going to always serve you better than any box you think you're supposed to fit into. The next thing that we're going to see pretty often across the board is that most less experienced writers, certainly if this is your first book, will need some structural support. Now, I think it is very, very easy to forget that even the most experienced writers cannot hold a whole book's worth of plot in their head. Truly, none of us can do that. And I want to clarify here just something that I think becomes a misconception sometimes. There is this term, if you've been hanging around the literary world long enough, you have no doubt heard it, called pantsing. Now, this is a short form version of flying by the seat of your pants, meaning that when you write a book by pantsing, you simply write. You do very, very little planning often, and you simply let the characters show you where they want to go. Now, there are many, many famous writers who stand by this method. Stephen King is very well known for being a pantser, which is amazing because his books are not only quite long, typically, but also have very complex plots, often with many, many characters, many more than we would expect in a typical novel. So what is happening here? Why is Stephen King able to pants these amazing stories, but I'm telling you that even experienced writers can't hold a plot in their head? The reason is, if you start out your book by pantsing, you will typically expect to spend much, much longer in revision. And I will tell you, most of the clients I work with would not even call that revision. They would call it rewriting. Because when you pants a book, you start by putting everything out there the way you think it'll go. You let the characters guide you. Stephen King is famous for saying that. He designs the place, he designs the characters, he lets them tell him where they want to go. But he does not expect that first draft then to be anything he would turn over to any reader, even his agent or any kind of close personal contact. Instead, he knows that because he pants that book, he's going to have to go back to the beginning and rewrite it. Now, if that is not enough of an argument for you for why pantsing is often not the way for a first-timer, let me add that pantsing a memoir is a particularly bad idea. When we think about pantsing a memoir, we give ourselves no structure at all to decide what goes in and what stays out. And what that means is when I have heard from people over the years who really tried to pants their memoir, very often they wound up with something that looked much more like a journal than something that read like a novel, something that would be interesting for people to engage with, something that their readers would not only finish, but finish and enjoy and tell their friends about. Pantsing is hardly ever good advice if you are a first-time writer. Instead, what I find is that when folks start out for their first book, what is the most supportive is a step-by-step process to get the development done. Now remember earlier, I said one thing that we have been working on our entire lives is our voice. On the other side of that, structure does have particular rules, and most of us had no exposure in K-12 or even college. So a step-by-step process is going to feel a little bit oversimplified. Some people really love that it feels oversimplified. Some people feel a little bit boxed in. But what I can tell you is if you can get through that sense that your story is oversimplified by taking a step-by-step process, you will be so much better off. That is a really early hurdle that many, many people have to get through. Really realizing and internalizing that you do need an outline. You do need a plan. As a side note, in our group program, the Memoir Method, we do start every single client out with our 7-step trademarked development process. This is going to take you all the way through dumping all of your ideas out, getting everything out that you might want in there, refining your topic and your message, and figuring out how they work together. All, of course, guided by tutorials just like this episode and companion worksheets. We take you all the way through plotting that arc so that your book will read like fiction if that's what you want, an engaging narrative that your audience can really connect with, and culminates in an outline that you can actually share with others for feedback and, within the program, with Emily and I for professional feedback before you even start writing. This takes so much pressure off first-time authors, and I can't tell you how valuable it is. But let me know if you'd like to see more about that program. You can check it out at pageandpodium.com/memoir-method, or make an appointment to talk to me about the program at pageandpodium.com/contact. Okay, so once you have gotten through that step-by-step process, once you have figured out how to structure your memoir as a whole, you will be so much more emboldened to play with that structure. Now, this, of course, is just like any new skill we're learning. At first, we kind of need those training wheels on there, right? We need that step-by-step thing. But the further you go through the process, the more you will start to feel your instincts guiding you in one direction or another. Now, I bet that there are at least a few of y'all watching this who are thinking, oh, that sounds like such a dream. How do I skip to that part? And y'all, I feel you. I feel you. Unfortunately, the only way to get to that point is to get in there and play. You've got to take those baby steps in the dark and feel your way through. But the good news is, if you get the structure part done correctly in the previous step I mentioned, at this point, you will start to feel freer and freer and freer. You will start to be able to think about your structure, at least for a chapter, in your head, at least in part, and you'll be able to play with how you want that structure to play out, both with the chapters, within your sections, within paragraphs and sentences, and of course, with your memoir as a whole. Now, this is my very favorite point in the process to support people, just because I love to see people having a big win. And we've had a lot of this lately in our group program of folks finally bringing in and sharing with us that they have learned to trust their instincts, that they're sharing, I think I was supposed to do X and Y and Z, but I actually wonder, I think that the right choice for the chapter might be to do A and B and C. And oh, it warms my heart, because almost always, once you get to this point where you're consistently playing in structure, you've got the accountability to keep moving forward, keep taking those baby steps, you will inevitably come to a point where your instincts are way, way better than any cookie cutter advice you could find on the internet. You will come to a point where you are feeling the way through to the next point. And oh, y'all, it feels so, so good. I can't wait for you to be there. If you are already there, well, that is such great news, because the good thing is that's not going to go away when you finish this book and start the next and the next. You have that as a lifelong skill, a lifelong instinct. Now, the next thing, this is number 4 if you're keeping track, is that at this point where you start to have stronger instincts, you start to feel a little more at home in the writing process. Unfortunately, it is going to feel like the rug gets pulled out from under you. And the reason is, now you've got your instincts, and because you've got your instincts, all of the writing advice on the internet is going to start to feel much, much less useful. Now, that is a bummer, and I totally hear that it's really difficult to kind of pull ourselves away from our old habits. But at the same time, what I want you to remember when you're in this stage is the reason it feels like that is, first of all, we're expanding that capacity for discomfort. And the way that we are expanding that capacity is by exploring your freedom. Now, one of the things that we really build our whole company on is this idea of constraints versus freedom. Something I don't hear talked about often enough in the arts world in general is the fact that every single piece of art, whether that is a memoir or a visual art or a song or a play or a movie, every single one of those is created under some set of constraints. Now, typically we'll have constraints that come from the genre or format itself. A book, for instance, needs to be written, needs to go on pages, whereas a movie needs to be a particular length to fit within particular industry expectations. But some of those constraints also come from ourselves. Those constraints can look like things that we believe a book should do. Those constraints can come from the negative feelings that we have about ourselves and whether we're able to even do this project we're trying to do. And they also often come from a sense of whether we even have a right to be working on this book. Is your story even worth it? Is it good enough? Will anyone care? But the beautiful thing when you start to get these instincts building up is that now you're starting to move away from some of those constraints. some of those shoulds, some of those self-doubts, some of those wondering about how you'll fit in the larger world once this book is done, a lot of those things are going to really start to feel a lot less like constraints. Well, now you're flowing into the freedom side of this binary, this dyad. Now you're exploring what it really means to create, to express, get things out of yourself in a way that is rewarding and satisfying. So, this is a double-edged sword because I do want to acknowledge that if you are somebody who has really gotten reliant on the internet, you spend a lot of time kind of watching videos like this, listening to podcasts, reading other people's blogs and books, this can feel a little bit out to sea. Again, I want to encourage you to remind yourself we're expanding capacity for discomfort, and having all of this freedom is actually really, really good for you. Once we get through that feeling of having too much freedom, guess what? Now we're able to start setting constraints that are purposeful, constraints that are meaningful, constraints that are about our particular audience, constraints that are about the goals we have for the book when it's finished, constraints about ourselves and our thought leadership. Well, these are the valuable constraints, right? First, we got to break away from the others. That's what's happening when you start to trust your instincts. Break away from all of the internet advice and explore what it feels like to really give ourselves the freedom to play. Because it's from that situation that we start to be able to develop the guiding constraints that we have chosen for ourselves. Now, the next step in the development of this writing process that I so often see is that we will have a kind of another stage happening around this time. Now, often around the time that I see folks start to trust their instincts, start to explore a little more freedom, start to shed the skin of some of those former constraints, usually you'll be about halfway through your book, oftentimes in what we call the messy middle, which is an episode that we've got coming up pretty soon. But as we are in that middle part, I do find that some things start to shift. On one hand, as I just mentioned, you will start to feel much more confident. You will start to feel much more intentional and in control and really guided by your purpose. But at the same time, you will also start to realize how much better you are as a writer than you were when you started. Now, this is not bad news. Oh my gosh, we love to improve a skill. But what it does signal to so many writers, and listen up if you're multitasking, this is important, is that often when you get to around that midpoint, the difference in your skill from the beginning to where you are now will falsely try to convince you that you should start over. You shouldn't. The thing that I actually think is pretty magical about the writing process, particularly when we're talking long form books, is that when you think about moving from chapter 1 through chapter 20, of course, you are always going to be better, more skilled in chapter 20 than you were in chapter 1. You've written 19 chapters since then, right? But the problem is when we think, well, I'll scrap this because now I know what I'm doing. I'll scrap this and start over. Well, guess what? You're still going to get to chapter 10 and be a lot better than you were at the new chapter 1. It's a cycle and it will continue forever. So what do we do here instead? Well, we've got to embrace our discomfort and resist our urge to run away, resist our urge to scrap the whole thing. Because if we can keep going, even as it does get harder when you move into those last few chapters, there is that voice telling you to stop, telling you to start over. As we move towards step 6, one thing that is happening is we are going through this challenging part. Often it can feel like dragging ourselves across the finish line, unfortunately. But we are also seeing that skilled growth. I encourage you to lean on that, lean on your new confidence, lean on your ability to play in a way you couldn't before to get that manuscript done. But the next thing that's coming in our step 6 is unfortunately something that often feels like despair. What will very, very often happen when you finish that first draft of the manuscript is it will come as kind of a surprise, even though you cognitively knew it, that you are going to have to revise. Now, we talk about revision a lot and very intentionally in the Memoir Method group because I hate the way that this sneaks up on folks, but it's probably going to sneak up on you. And very often when we get to this point of transitioning into the revision, we start to feel really frustrated, and not always only with ourselves, often with the manuscript, often with anyone that is supporting us, often with the world in general. And this can sound like self-talk that sounds like, I thought I was done with this, or how I'm supposed to cut stuff? I spent so long, I worked so hard putting it on paper. Why would I delete anything? It's going to feel like resistance. It's going to feel like it's the last thing you want to do. So when we get to this stage, the thing to remember is that this actually will start to lead you to the fun part. Now, when you first start revising, we have a video on this channel. It's back a couple years called How to Revise Your Manuscript. Go find that video. We give some pretty practical tips on how to get started on this. But the main advice we always share is to go through your structure first. Now, we suggest starting with a reverse outline. In this case, where before we outlined and then used the outline to write our manuscript, now we're using our manuscript, looking what's in there to create an outline based on what actually exists. So this is a much more boring process than it sounds like, but effectively what you are doing is going section or chunk by chunk through your manuscript and making a note in your own notes document in a new outline of what you're seeing on the page. So do we start with a scene about the first time you and Aunt Sally got in a fight? Well, write on your reverse outline, scene, fight, Aunt Sally. That's all you need, just a little bit. Well, then is the next piece a reflection on the historical context of the moment? All right, well, let's write that down. Historical context, what was going on? Then is the next part a scene? And so on and so forth until we have noted our entire memoir into this outline format. This is going to do a lot of things for you, but the reason I really want you to do it first is it really helps you get a sense of what you're actually working with. And one thing that I do find when we go into revisions is somehow we're both overly optimistic and overly pessimistic. There is somehow both within the same person a sense that it is nowhere near good enough, it cannot be good enough, never will be good enough, and the sense that you have worked so hard and you're really proud of what you did. Well, be proud. You did work hard. You can get your manuscript to where you want it to be, but there is a significant chunk of work left. So go into this process realizing that you have done something pretty amazing. Look at that outline. Look at all you have done. But at the same time, I want you to recognize that it's not up to your standards, that there is more that you can do here. You can go through and make structural changes, move things around. You can go through and improve that sentence structure, improve the flow. It just takes some work. But I want to add here that you are also at this point going to see the total escalation of feeling really detached from all of the advice that you have been around before. And the reason is, when you first started writing this book, remember what I said, everybody pretty much needs a step-by-step. Everybody pretty much needs a really clear guide of how to. As you move through the process, remember, as I said, you get more used to the structure, you can play more with instinct, you can trust yourself more, you can be free, you can really get in there and make it your own. And as you're going through that process, all that internet advice is getting less and less and less relevant, because in the beginning, you were able to take that advice and use it to apply it to your story. But now your story exists, and that advice, it wasn't written for it. So now you will often find that you are needing the most personalized, most custom advice that you have ever needed. And often this is a time, if you haven't already recruited professional support, to get some professional support in there to help yourself. Okay, so as you are going through the revisions, a lot is happening here. And as I just said, really, we start to have a lot of divergence in what this looks like for different people. But I do want to give one final note, because I think that this is something that is going to be relatable, even though it's the kind of thing that's a little bit heavier than I usually talk about. It might feel a little bit kind of disappointing. Come with me. I promise it's okay. One thing that will likely happen as you are coming through rounds and rounds and rounds of revision, and yes, it will take rounds, very often you will start to realize that you are just tired. You will start to realize that this is a really good book. And you know what? A lot of those revisions you wanted to make, they're just not worth it anymore. I will tell you, as someone who has written many, many books, both for myself and others, I'll talk about my books. I've not ever published a book where I made every revision that I initially thought I needed to make. Not one. Because in every single case, I realized that I was trying to hold my standards, my bar, to a level of perfection. And in every single one, I realized that that's what I was doing and that that was not a possible standard. That there was not ever going to be a final pass where I didn't find a single thing I wanted to change. Just doesn't happen. So for me and many of the clients I've worked with, oftentimes having an external deadline from a publisher was really what I needed to really get me to make the revisions that I felt strongly about, to make the polish that I believed really did make that book sing, but then to back away at a level short of perfection, because I realize, and I hope you will too, that art is never perfect, that the point of it is that it is not perfect, and that we could infinitely revise, and it would still not be perfect. Now, as a side note, I will tell you this, once you have that book in your hands, once you have been through the publishing process, one of my oldest and most tried and true pieces of writer's advice is do not open that book. Once it is at the point that it has already gone through printing, there is literally nothing you can do. So, make peace with the fact that there's probably a typo in there. There probably is. There's probably something in there that you would improve now that you've continued to write, now that you've continued to grow. And that's okay. It is all right for us to be vulnerable and authentic and imperfect as long as we are getting across the message we want to get across and it is reaching our readers the way we want it to. Oh, and one more little thing. One thing that I find almost across the board is there's some point about the middle of these stages, usually around the time we're exploring freedom, usually around the time we're really thinking about our instincts, that other ideas for books will start to come to mind. And this is so good, y'all. I know it feels a little overwhelming when you're still working on the book you're working on, but you've got 3 more in your head. I know. But one thing you can try to do is really try to think about, you can write those other books. Once you have been through this process, well, now you know what to expect. You have not certainty exactly, but at least some sense of what's possible and what's probable. And there is nothing I love more than seeing somebody set out to write just one memoir, just my memoir, and then come to the end of the process and realize they have so much more to say. Y'all, say it. If I can help, schedule a call with me at pageandpodium.com/contact. On these calls, I listen to what your idea is. We talk through what your goal for the entire book is, what you want to do with it, and what you want it to do for you. We look at the ways that Page and Podium can help you, and if we can't, I'll let you know that too. It is a low-stakes, low-pressure conversation, and I would love to hear about your book in one of these hour slots. You can book one at pageandpodium.com/contact, and until then, happy writing. Most memoirs don't fail for lack of time. They fail for lack of clarity, because their author is trying to move forward in a process that is unfamiliar and unclear with no one to support their efforts. And that's why I put together something very practical, the Memoir Method Checklist. This is designed to give you every single step in the process so you not only know what you need to work on now, you know what's coming next, and after that, until you have that beautiful published book in your hands. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.